well, I'll just sit over there. Okay.
We don't have one, but it's easy. Sagst du auch oder sag ich kurz was? Du wirst gebraucht, Thorsten.
Sind wir schon startklar?
Hi.
Hi, Thorsten. I'm the moderator tonight.
Nice to meet you. Thank you so much. Thank you for everything.
Ich begrüße als Gastgeber kurz. Ja, gerne. Und dann sagst du 2 Worte und dann.
Genau, passt. Gerne, genau. Ich hatte noch zwischendrin die Vorstellung.
Ah, okay. Wo ist der?
Genau, ich bin gerade im Vorschlag.
Okay. Ja, ich schaue mir wer Florian ist.
Gar nicht gesehen.
Ich war da vorne beschäftigt, den Livestream aufzunehmen. So stehe ich jetzt. Okay, wir haben ungefähr eine Minute.
Okay. Okay. A warm welcome from my side. I'm Holger, and I'm your host tonight. I have the pleasure to work in this wonderful office space, which we would like to share with you tonight for this wonderful Bitcoin meeting. And thanks to everyone who participated in organizing it. Michael, as Bitcoin Munich veteran, helped us. It's his meeting tonight, and it's only our facility which we would like to share with you. We've got 2 great speakers today. We've got Gabrielle, which gives a short introduction with a live talk about how situation in Venezuela is and how people use Bitcoin and cryptocurrency to survive. And then I'm very happy later on that we had the chance to have Saif with us today, who is a world-famous economist specialized on Bitcoin. He's just recently finished his latest book, The Bitcoin Standard, which you can buy here directly from him. I've got... I just missed that he starts. Can you hand over the mic to me?
Oh,
First here.
sure.
Then later change.
Just so like.
I'm totally sorry. I've only got 1 speaker's present today for Saif because I didn't know Gabriel was coming, so I have only...
I gave him one of my books, so I think.
Yeah, that would be great. Yeah.
Hello.
I have a speaker's present for Saif. It's a book I recently read. It's called Should We Eat Meat? And it's not written by a vegan or by a vegetarian because I know he wouldn't read it then. It's written by a famous economist, and he has a very serious approach on this topic, and I think that helps you with your arguments on this topic.
Thank you so much.
It's really a great book.
Great, thanks a lot.
Okay. I've got two more short remarks. The first one is our emergency exit is located between the two chimneys, so it's like 15 meters on the right. So in case anything happens here, fire, smoke, whatever appears unusual to you, don't use the elevators, use the emergency staircase, which is 15 meters to the right. Second point, we have toilets here on the 11th floor, which are 5 meters to the right for the man, and like 10 meters to the left for the women. And if later on there should be a rush on the toilets, there is a second set of toilets in the 10th floor. So if you don't get in there in time, just try it in the 10th floor. We've got some food prepared for you after the talks. It's the first non-pizza meetup we have. It's meatballs later on, so I hope you all enjoy it. And there's a little bit of vegetarian stuff Saif doesn't see because we hide it around the corner, which you can eat if you don't eat meat. Thanks for coming. It's a great pleasure to have you all here. And maybe Thorsten from the Bitcoin. So, do you want to say a few words for introduction? Okay.
Really, just a few words.
Yeah, that's perfect.
Yeah, and what I want to say is thank to you for having us today and tonight in this great location. So give a warm welcome. Thank you to Mike for putting this again together, and I'm looking forward to everything Alice said. Thanks.
So, gut. Fangen wir an dann. Ich kann noch ein bisschen Deutsch, aber es wäre besser vielleicht für mich auf Englisch zu sprechen. So, I'm very happy to be here to share with you guys some of my life experience. I don't really have a speech prepared or anything, but I would like to share what I have lived through the past 3 years of my life, very shortly, of course, so that you guys can understand how this can be also very important for all of you. You see, I come from a background in Venezuela, right? Very, let's call it alternative, let's call it against the established powers, let's call it the bank haters, let's call it the guys, the underdogs, okay? I come from that. What does that mean? When I was raised up, I did have enough to eat, I did have a house, I had everything because my father could provide. But as I grew older and older, I learned that the society is in a big mess. You know, how did I came to the Bitcoin scene? It was like after I graduated from university, I graduated from business school, okay, in Venezuela. I always wonder, why is always the biggest, but not today, this is not a bank, but why is the biggest building on every city always is a bank? Why? How come the governments own money to the bank, the people, the families own money to the bank, and the enterprises own money to the bank? How come this happens, you know? So I started thinking about it, reading, learning, so I came to understand how the fiat system works, how the bank system works, how these people actually rip everyone off, okay? So I was like, oh my God, what I'm gonna do? I'm doomed. I'm doomed, completely doomed. I'm gonna be a slave for the rest of my life. No way. So I started investigating, and then I found cryptocurrencies, okay? When I found this, this was mid-2015, around mid-2015. Bitcoin was already declining, was around $200 by the time. So I was like, is this thing for real? Is this real? Does any one of you have Bitcoin? Please raise your hand. All right, we're good here. But for the other people who don't have yet, maybe they're like, is this real? Yes, it's real. So I wanted to check if this was true. So what I did is I started investigating more and more how this system works, what is proof of work, how is these machines generating money, how is this everything working? So I went, okay, I think I know enough. By that time, Bitcoin was around $300, okay? So I had a business in Venezuela of selling cars, okay? I buy cars, fix them, and sell them back again, because in Venezuela you can't buy a new car. Oh, what about that? It's impossible. It's very expensive. You have to import it, and it's out of anyone's normal people's reach. You know, it's only for rich people. Okay, so I had this business, so I said, okay, I'm going to sell one of my cars. I'm going to give it a try. Okay, so I did. I sold it. By that time, I sold it for $2,600. Okay, and I bought myself 2 ASIC miners. Okay, just to give it a try, 2 S7s. So I started mining on the 23rd of March of 2016. Okay, that's when I started. So when I started collecting the Bitcoin, I was like, okay, this is good, but what do I do with it now? Okay, I have Bitcoin. What do I do with it? So I started reaching out to people in Venezuela. By that time, it was not that famous at all in our country. And economic situation in Venezuela was still pretty good, you might say, compared to what is it right now. So there was not such a huge need. So I started investigating even more, and then I found out these ways of trading the Bitcoin. Okay? Trading it for what? For bolívares. Where? At local Bitcoins. And one exchange that at that time existed. So with this happening on, I learned more and more, and the economic situation just started to get worse and worse and worse. How is this getting worse? Because sadly, our government is very corrupt, and they have stole all the money from the oil production. And in the last 3 years, the oil prices also went down, and the Venezuelan government got without any money. So the only solution they came up with was to inflate the currency. Very easy for the government, okay? We just go and steal a little bit of money from everyone in the country, and then we, the government, have enough money to pay for whatever we want, and keep stealing the money if we want to also. So after I learned this, you know, I thought of, okay, Bitcoin will give you freedom, but this is not enough. At that time, there was only one exchange. So I figured out that this was going to be a big thing in the future. Okay, we were still in 2016, and the second halving was not done yet, so it was still 50 Bitcoins. Sorry, yeah, 25 Bitcoins after each block. So then I decided and said, okay, there's only one exchange and local Bitcoin, so I think there is a business opportunity here. So what I did at the time, I sold all my other cars, and I bought all of it in Bitcoin. By that time, it was around $450, around that. So I bought around 20, 25 Bitcoins, and hold, okay? Kept working, didn't spend my Bitcoins, only spent from what I mined, so I wouldn't spend everything. I didn't have any more a job at that time. When I started mining, I actually stopped selling and buying cars, and I started living off of Bitcoin. You know, it's possible, you know. It happened to me. This is why I'm telling you this story, because it's real, and I want you to know that it's real. So I kept mining. I bought all the Bitcoin that I could. I wanted to sell my mom's house and some other stuff, but she wouldn't let me. She was like, "You're crazy." And I'm like, "Yeah, a little bit, but you'll see, Mom. Just wait." But no, we couldn't sell her house. So anyway, I bought these Bitcoins, kept studying, and found a way to start an exchange. Had the idea, okay? Because there was only one. So I was like, okay, if this exchange goes off or whatever, Venezuelans are going to be left without any exchange. So I think there's a good opportunity. So I started looking for software enterprises, for developers, and so on and so forth, while Bitcoin was steadily climbing up, okay? It was like 600 and like 700 and like back to 600 and then so on and so forth. So by the time Bitcoin was around $1,100, I had enough money, okay, to start my business. So I did. But first, I was in a big problem, because how can you make a business where you can trade your bolívares for something and then go and do whatever you want in a socialist country, where there's control for everything, where there is a black market for everything, for taking your passport, for having an ID, for having a Führerschein, for, you know, for anything that you can imagine, there is a black market for it. Why? Because governments, in their stupid idea of trying to control prices while stealing money from the people, what happened? Everybody will not sell their stuff at the price that is set. For instance, beton, cement, you have to pay 10 times more what the price tag says. No, if not, they don't sell it. And so goes with oil for your car, tires, batteries, and whatever you can imagine of. All the prices are controlled. So people don't sell their things at the controlled prices, but they sell it on behind, you know, on the backstage of the store or through the telephone or however they can do it. So I had to go by force to this government and sit and talk with them and tell them, look, guys, with the military guys, right there in the mouth of the wolf, as we call it in Spanish. So I went there and I talked to them and I told them, look, I want to do an exchange. This is going to be good for everyone. And there's nothing you can do about stopping cryptocurrency. There's no way you're going to stop it. You can put all controls you want, you can put all laws you want, but since it can be traded peer-to-peer and people can exchange their bitcoins for whatever they like, you will never, ever, ever stop it. So you might as well just let me do my work. And they went like, okay, sounds convincing, you can do it. We will be looking at you, huh? Don't mess things up, don't go stealing people's money like we do, but you be good, Gabriel, you go on. So I had this green light. I did not get an official written license. No, I did not get it. It was all talks inside the government because the government cannot publicly at that time say, okay, we're letting these guys do their thing. No, they want to keep the people thinking that they are in control. And most people believe that, sadly. So we started. It was the 7th of June of last year, almost a year now. So you can say how this freedom that gives you Bitcoin can take you to a whole different level in your life, to each one of you. So, and you can also know by yourself that whatever you guys do in your life, it has an impact, and it can have a big impact on the whole world. See, I'm just a guy, just one guy, right? But with a thought and a drive, you can do a lot of things, like putting an exchange on a socialist country and actually help people. There's well over 22,000 users of our platform. And, you know, people count on this. Why? Because you can't understand. I try to explain to you. If you go and buy bread today for €1, and if you're in Venezuela, tomorrow is €1.50, and the day after tomorrow is €2. And that is with everything. So you have to spend your fiat like that, really quick, because if you wait one day, then you will not be able to buy whatever it was that you wanted. So what do people do? Okay, what do people do? They take their bolívares, however they have it, however amount. They may have sold an apartment, sold a car, sold a bicycle, or from the regular job, the money that they get from the regular job, they go instantly as soon as they get it and they transfer it to the company and buy crypto like that, because they know tomorrow Bitcoin is going to be worth more in bolívares and they will be safe. So if you want to keep living in Venezuela and not die of hunger, you have to have crypto. If you don't have crypto, you are very, very, very poor. You're going to be very poor because the money that you use from the government is just worth less every single day. Actually, I will tell you this little story. When I got to Europe just a month ago, we would trade Bitcoin for around 7.5 billion bolívares, okay? Billion, which is 1,000 million, okay? In English, okay? In Spanish it's different. But when we started a year ago, Bitcoin was around $2,000, and in bolívares it was around 15 million, 18 million, and now is, I will tell you, 1 month ago, 7.5 billion, now 11.9 billion, okay? So it's 11.9 billions. It's just so much money. And for a regular person in Venezuela that holds a regular job, you know, a normal job where you will get here maybe 12,000 euros a month or 800 euros, you know, just a regular job, In Venezuela, you will get maybe 10 million bolívares for 1 month of work. And now the rate is almost 2 million bolívares for €1. Can you believe that? Would you work your whole month for maybe 10 euros? What can you do with that? So the situation in Venezuela, if I might say a bad word, is pretty fucked up. Pretty bad. And we thought just 3 months ago the government was gonna go and launch this cryptocurrency. I don't know if you heard of it, Petro. I was interviewed in many YouTube channels about it. People were asking me and so on and so forth. I will always say it's a good idea. I hope it works. I don't know if they're really gonna actually launch it the right way. I don't know. My hands are not there. And what happened? They promised it for March. It never came out. For April, never came out. For May, never came out. We're almost June, and where is Petro? We don't know. So what is good about this situation? What is good? There's always good and bad, okay? What is good is that the government, since December, made these new laws, okay, because they are desperate and they know this is their only way out, that they will start buying and selling the goods that Venezuela produces outside of Venezuela for crypto, to a point where you can also pay your taxes with cryptocurrency, which is the first thing that makes a currency worth something in a country. Euros are worth here because you can pay your taxes with euro, such as you can pay in Colombia, you pay your taxes with Colombian pesos, in Argentina, and so on. And in Venezuela, you will pay your taxes with bolívares. Now, you can pay with crypto. So what this means is that the doors have been opened in Venezuela, okay? We will be the first crypto nation in the world. I will assure you that. Right now, there's around 5 to 10 million users of cryptocurrency in the world. When the whole Venezuelan country goes crypto, which is very close from now, because they need it, because their money doesn't work anymore, we will have in the world at least 20 to 30 million people using crypto. And in Venezuela is the perfect place for experimentation, because you know how much money it will cost to cripple a country to a point where its money is not worth anymore. You will have to spend a lot of money, and they did it. They completely screwed the country. So it's the perfect situation for this experiment. So the only thing that we can do now, instead of complaining about the government or complaining about this and that, governments are always going to be the same. It doesn't matter if you're in the 1930s or the 2030. Governments are always the same. Banks are always the same. Situations are always the same. Winter comes always, and then comes fruiting. You know, always is like that. There's nothing we can do about it. The only thing we can do about it is what we do about it. It's how we see things. It's how we work on ourselves to be a better person. When you reach that level, then you can give more. You can give to everyone. You can give to the people knowledge, experience, fun, or whatever it is that you want to give. So I would like to close this just by saying to you, you have to believe in yourself, okay? You have to be 100% sure that what you do is not insignificant. Each one of you are very important, because each one of you can make a big difference in the world. Sometimes we might feel like, oh, I'm just one person. Oh, who's gonna do what I say? Oh, how is my idea gonna be done? That's not, that you don't have to think about that. You just have to think about the goal that you want to reach. And in the way of doing it and getting there, you will find a way on how to do it. You don't have to worry about the whole step on how to become whatever it is that you want to become. You just go first step. Okay, today I went to a Bitcoin meeting. Tomorrow I do this. The day after tomorrow, this. And so on. So you start building yourself with the crypto community. So there's more than 1,500 cryptowährungen, crypto coins around the world. Each one of you can be a promoter of one of them, okay? So it's not only about Bitcoin. Okay, Bitcoin is the biggest, it's the oldest, it's the most secure. We all know that. I agree, I love Bitcoin. But I also love Bitcoin Cash. I also love Smart Cash. I also love Litecoin. I love all cryptocurrencies, and unless the ones that are scams, of course. And there are plenty of scams. So you have to know how to investigate. And what I can tell you, what I want to give you is this knowledge that you have to trust in yourself and be sure of what you want to do. And know, I want to tell you, you can do it because I did it, okay? If I did it, you can do it. Anyone can do it, yeah? Thank you. It's for you. Yes, thank you. Yeah, hold on. There. You shine.
Thank you. Okay. First of all, thank you very much for everybody at Maribor & Wolf and the Bitcoin Meetup for organizing this. It's a real pleasure to be back in Munich. It's one of my favorite cities. And I've enjoyed my trip here. And thank you so much for giving me the chance. Secondly, thank you very much, Gabrielle, for this beautiful and inspiring talk. And I really couldn't think of a better way to introduce my book because you know, if you wanted an explanation of the early chapters of my book, or if you wanted a live example of what it is that my book talks about, I think the example that Gabrielle brings up is the vivid personification of this. In particular, just the difference between good money and bad money, and why the process of good money killing bad money is an inevitable thing that is going to happen. And the only thing that you can do is just try and be on the right side of it. So today, I'm going to briefly talk about some of the main ideas in my book. And I would like to, I'm not going to spend a lot of time making it into a lecture. I decided not to use a PowerPoint presentation because that can get a little bit boring. The idea is to have it be more of a discussion. So I'm just going to mention a few of the main ideas, and then you feel free to ask any questions you want. Or if you want to discuss anything in the book that I did not get to, that's also perfectly fine by me. So the first idea in my book is that Bitcoin is very unique as money. Bitcoin is a pretty unique form of money, and it's a form of money that we've never had anything like before. Why is that the case? In my opinion, Bitcoin is unique because it is the hardest money that we have ever invented as human beings. And I think this is why Bitcoin really matters. So, you know, the ways in which Bitcoin work and the function of Bitcoin and all of the stuff, you know, the decentralization and I think all of that is important because it makes Bitcoin work. But I think the reason Bitcoin is important itself, the reason it's far more than just a new cool software project or a new cool network, the reason I think it's a defining invention for us as humanity is that this is the best form of money that we've ever invented. Why do I say that? Because in my book, the first few chapters, I go through the history of different forms of money, discuss why they became money, why did they lose their monetary status. And my argument is that the most important metric for determining what ends up being money and what doesn't is the supply growth rate. How much the supply of a particular good increases in a certain period of time determines whether that thing will be good as a form of money or not. So if you store your wealth, and this is, you know, it's a product of, first of all, people thinking about it and understanding it, but they don't have to think about it and understand it. It's a product of the natural selection process of what happens when people just make their decisions, and then economic reality rewards the people who make the better decisions. So if you put your money, if you decide to store your wealth, the quintessential function of money, of course, is that it's a medium of exchange. But in order for it to be a medium of exchange, people need to be willing to accept it as a store of value. People need to be willing to store value in it. So the property, in my opinion, that determines whether something gets used as money or not is how well it serves as a store of value. And that, in turn, is primarily determined by how much its supply can be made to increase in case demand for it increases. So if people decide to go and put their money in, say, something like copper, which is easy to produce, it's relatively easy for copper miners to ramp up economic production of copper, increase the mining of copper, and keep increasing the supply of copper until they bring the price of copper down, okay? So this is why if everybody in Germany today decided they wanted to use copper as money, initially, what would happen to the price of copper? It will spike because everybody's storing, you know, tons of copper in their backyard as money. That's a lot of copper production, the price goes up. But then copper miners realize this is a great profit opportunity. Is there anything to stop them from flooding the market with more copper? No, they'll just keep flooding it with more and more and more copper until the price goes back to its original rough price, roughly more or less. And everybody who stored their wealth in copper, what happens to them? Yeah, you lose your wealth. You bought at a high level because you thought this is the money of the future, and then they inflated the supply and it crashed down, and so you lost your wealth. You can think of this process with copper happening on a scale of thousands of years across the world with all kinds and forms of money. And the result of it is that when people store their money in something that is hard to make, and historically, what was the hardest thing to make? Gold. If people who store their money, their wealth in gold, who use gold as a store of value, end up preserving their wealth much better into the future. So the people who put their money in copper or in seashells or in anything else will find that their wealth is is not growing and it's not being preserved. It's losing its value more and more because it's easy to make seashells. It's easy to make all of these other kinds and forms of money. Gold remained by 1900, all of the world was on gold as money because gold had practically killed every other form of money out there, including silver, by the end of the 19th century. Because, you know, with industrialization and communication, gold could travel everywhere, and any part of the world that was using anything else other than gold as money was at a severe disadvantage. So China and India, for instance, were on a silver standard until the late 1900s, and as silver lost its monetary role in the 1870s, the price of silver crashed, and so India and China were in deep trouble because their wealth essentially was destroyed, and it was a major problem for why the development of China and India in the late 19th century slowed down because of this. So we see this process repeating itself, and there are many examples of this, of what happens with easy money and hard money. And there's an example of, say, what are called the slave beads, or the glass beads that were used in Africa, in West Africa, as money, because it was very rare. The technology to make glass was very rare in Africa, and so glass beads were very rare, and because they were very rare and hard to make, they were useful as a store of value. But once Europeans came, it was very easy for them to make glass beads, but it wasn't easy for Africans to make gold ounces. So the Europeans would go back to Europe and fill up entire boats with little glass beads and then ship them all the way back to Africa and then use them to buy things in Africa. And after time, of course, you know, when it's very cheap for them to make the glass beads that people are using as a store of value, it's very cheap for you to take the value that people have stored in it. And as a result, Europeans were able to take the wealth of West Africa through this form. And this is why they eventually became the slave beads, because people eventually started selling slaves for them, because it destroyed the entire wealth of people who were there. And I think this is an important lesson because, you know, money is not just something that allows us to have things that we want to buy. This is the 20th century consumerist idea of money. Money is far more important. It's the coordinating mechanism of economic activity. It's what allows us to accumulate wealth and across time and across generations. It's what allows us to build civilization and increase our productivity over time. And if you destroy that function by increasing the supply of money quickly, as we see in Venezuela, or as we saw with the glass beads, or with all these other examples, you're completely destroying the wealth that people hold in that money. And that's a big problem. So why is this important to Bitcoin? Because Bitcoin, as you may have heard, is the hardest money that has ever been invented. Bitcoin's supply growth rate right now is at around 4% per year, which is about double the supply growth rate of gold. I should have mentioned that gold, the reason gold gets used as money all over the world is that its supply grows at roughly only 2% per year, every year. It only grows at around that level. It can't grow much faster or slower because it's very hard to find it, and also because the stockpiles keep piling up because it doesn't corrode. We've got thousands of years of gold production lying around, and all this year's production can't be that significant compared to it. So gold grows at around 1.5 to 2% per year. Bitcoin right now is growing at around 4% per year. But what happens if, and what is going to happen now is that this growth rate, as you know, is going to continue to decline until it's going to drop to below 2 and then below 1.5%. And eventually it flattens out and it stops growing. The the supply for Bitcoin is strictly scarce. And I think this is very important for two reasons. The first one is the difficulty adjustment in Bitcoin. This, in my opinion, the genius of Bitcoin, and the reason that Bitcoin works, and the reason that it was workable as opposed to all the previous attempts that it built on, and the only thing that, well, the main thing that distinguishes it from the previous attempts, you know, if you read the history of the attempts to build digital cash, we had many, many attempts that, you know, kept on improving on each other. Satoshi Nakamoto put the final cherry on the cake, and that made it work. And in my opinion, that final detail was the difficulty adjustment. Without the difficulty adjustment, it would not have been possible for it to work. What does the difficulty adjustment do? It is really not only does it let the system work, but also it's what makes Bitcoin the best money that we've ever had. Because when any other thing gets used as money, if you use gold as money, if you use silver as money, if you use copper, if you use anything as money, the people who, you using it as money raises its price, that incentivizes more production. So even with gold, there will always be more production if the price rises, and there will be less production if the price drops. So in other words, with everything in the world, supply is responsive to increases in demand. If the demand increases, the price goes up, the supply goes up. Except Bitcoin. Why? Because Bitcoin, as you may have heard, does not care. It is programmed to not care about you or anything that you do. So if the supply for Bitcoin goes up, what happens? The price of Bitcoin goes up, right? Mining becomes more profitable. More people want to mine Bitcoin. What does that mean? Do we get more Bitcoins? Exactly. We get the same number of Bitcoin. It doesn't matter if 10 people want to use Bitcoin tomorrow or if 10 billion people want to use Bitcoin. Bitcoin doesn't care. It's only going to make 1,800 coins a day or whatever number it's making right now. So the supply is completely unresponsive. Instead, how do we make sure that the mining process continues to produce only the same amount of coins? The difficulty adjusts. So the difficulty of mining goes up, so it becomes more expensive to mine, which means more processing power goes into it, which means the difficulty of mining increases, and effectively this makes the network safer. So with every other money, when people use it as money, its supply is going to react by increasing, bringing the price down. In other words, there's always this trap or a negative feedback mechanism, which is the increased supply as a response to demand. Only gold beats that trap because it's very hard to find it and increase the supply for it. But Bitcoin completely destroys that trap and doesn't even beat it because it's completely irresponsive. The demand for it is completely irresponsive to the supply is completely irresponsive to the demand. And so instead, whereas with every other metal or thing that gets chosen as money, even government money, if more people use it, the value goes up and then the supply increases. With Bitcoin, more people use it, the value goes up, the security of the network goes up, which makes it even more attractive as a store of value, which then attracts more demand, which raises the price further, which makes it more secure, and as you can see, this process just continues to feed on itself. This is basically the economic black hole that Satoshi Nakamoto unleashed on the world. And potentially, you know, the only way that this thing is going to stop is when it eats us all, and we all submit to it. There's no way out of this cycle. You know, with anything else, the difficulty of mining, the new supply of mining might reduce the ability of the currency to grow like that. If you had a government and it was issuing its own money, as the value of the money goes up, they're going to be tempted to print more, as we saw everywhere, and they will print more. Except with Bitcoin. With Bitcoin, the supply is completely irresponsive, and so therefore the network continues to grow more secure. And this is effectively why what we're seeing right now. It's the process of the monetization of a good. Very quickly, what happened with gold, over thousands of years, the competition that gold had to beat, over thousands of years from copper and metals and silver and all of that, it's happening with Bitcoin at the speed of a few years only. And we're seeing it in front of us, how it's rising compared to all the other forms of money. And of course, you know, the first forms of money that are suffering the most are the ones like Venezuela, which are growing at a faster supply. And so the fact that countries like Venezuela and Zimbabwe continue to exist means, you know, these are just small fish for Bitcoin to eat. But then as Bitcoin eats them, imagine if, you know, another year or two of Venezuela continuing, as he's saying, Then we have an entire country in Latin America running on Bitcoin. So then Bitcoin has become much bigger. Then it can eat an even bigger country, and then it gets bigger and bigger and bigger. This is really, I think, why it's worth paying attention to Bitcoin, because it's not just a product, and it's not something that, it's not an iPhone or where you can decide, you know what, I don't like iPhones, I'm going to go with Android. It's not optional. It's a technology that is, if you don't want to use it, that doesn't mean you will isolate yourself from its consequences. People who lived in West Africa couldn't just decide, we don't want to use gold as money, we want to stick to using the glass beads as money. Because it's very easy for others to make the glass beads. If they have harder money than you, it's essentially trivial for them to take away all of your wealth through producing your easy money with their hard money. So that's really why I think Bitcoin is very unique. And the implication of this, the first one, as I said, is the difficulty adjustment. The second implication of this is that Bitcoin is not just hard to make. Bitcoin is also strictly scarce, meaning Bitcoin is the only liquid asset that we have whose quantity is strictly limited, and we cannot increase it beyond that fixed number. So if you think about all the other metals and resources that we have on Earth, yes, the Earth is finite. The Earth is indeed a finite place. But let's face it, we've barely scratched the surface of the Earth looking for metals. I mean, the Earth's diameter is what, 12,000 kilometers? The biggest hole that anybody has ever dug is 3 kilometers. So there's still 11,997 kilometers of stuff down there which we could dig into and get more resources. So does that mean that we have an infinite abundance of resources? No, because the scarcity of the resources is determined by what? By their relative cost to each other and how much time we dedicate to them. The only thing that's really scarce is our time as human beings. So the only reason we don't have an endless quantity of oil is not because the Earth doesn't contain enough for us. It's because digging for more oil becomes more and more expensive, and so it has a higher opportunity cost in terms of other things. So we could double oil production or copper production or any other metal. We could double the quantity that we produce from it if we just simply reduce the production of other things. But that's what prices do. Prices regulate the supply and the demand and to regulate those things. But Bitcoin is different because we could get more of anything. And all of history we've been digging for things and we've never run out of anything because, as I said, we've barely scratched the surface. So we continue to find more and more and more. And there's really no limit on how much gold or oil or copper there ever is going to be. But with Bitcoin, there is. And this, I think, is very important because if you think about it, as I was saying, the only really scarce thing is human time. And a great economist called Julian Simon wrote a book called The Ultimate Resource. And the ultimate resource is human time, because only thing that is scarce is human time. Because with human time, we can produce anything else, and we can produce more of anything else. So if we had an infinite amount of human labor, we could make an infinite amount of resources. But we don't. And that's the limit on all the other resources. So therefore, if you think about it this way, our time is the only thing that's really scarce. And how do we try to manage our time? Through the technology of money. What do we do with money? We produce value right now with our time, and then we store that value in money so that we're able to spend it later and consume with it later. But thinking of the different monies that we have in the world, you can imagine that the increase of the supply of the money is like an inefficiency in it. It's like the inefficiency of an engine. It's not optimal that you put your wealth which you produced in your scarce time that is going to end on this earth, and then you store it in something that is not scarce, which is possible for other people to inflate and increase the supply of, therefore bringing the price down. But with Bitcoin, we don't have to do that anymore. And this is why I think Bitcoin is arguably the best store of value that we've ever invented, because its supply cannot be increased beyond the 21 million. So if you're buying, if you work right now for a month and you earn 7,000 whatever dollars and you buy one Bitcoin, this is 1 out of 21 million Bitcoins, and nobody will ever make any more of it. So nobody will ever be able to take your wealth that you stored in that Bitcoin by producing more Bitcoins than there already is, and there already is scheduled. With everything else, people can take your wealth, as we see in Venezuela, without having to rob you or put a gun to your head, just by printing more of your money. Bitcoin fixes that completely, ends that problem, and I think, it's for the first time we have something that is truly scarce, just like human time. And that's why I think it's going to naturally end up being the store of value for human time, because it does the job, I think, better than anything whose supply can be increased. This is really the economic importance of Bitcoin. Now, another, of course, very important aspect that I find from this is what would be the implication for us as a society if we have a form of money that holds its value so well into the future? And this 3 chapters of my book are really dedicated towards analyzing this question, primarily by comparing the modern 20th century with the 19th century, which was mainly on a gold standard. And, you know, we like to think of our world as always progressing and things are always getting better and life is always getting better. It's because, you know, this is how we're programmed to think. But in many, many ways, it's not the case. Yeah, Venezuela is a good example of how things don't always get better. But, you know, maybe it's not just Venezuela. If you think about it, people in the 19th century, they used to save much more. Why did they save much more? Why did they not consume a lot of stupid stuff that they didn't need? Well, possibly there was not much, but I think a more accurate reason is that when people's wealth holds value, when money is able to hold value over time, just like gold does, you're incentivized to think of consuming less so that you're able to hold value. Of course, you're not going to consume zero because you need to survive, but think of it this way. If I told you your money is going to lose 10% of its value next year, you're more likely to spend it, right? Yeah, just like in Venezuela, I was saying, you know, when you get the paycheck, people want to spend it the same day. The more severe the inflation, the more people are going to be driven towards spending. Now, what Bitcoin does then, I think, is that it would, if people start using it, and I think those of you who have started holding Bitcoin will see this, that you start really appreciating the value of money more because it appreciates. Whereas, you know, with your dollars and your euros, they're always losing value all the time, so, you know, you might as well just spend them. So our generation, compared to 100 years ago, we don't have a culture of saving. We don't save. We keep spending our parents' money until they stop giving us money, at which point we start borrowing banks' money and then spend all of our life slaving away until we can pay them back, if we can. And you know, the price for paying off your loan is you get a bigger loan for something else. You know, you pay off your education, then you get a housing loan and so on. So it used to be that 100 years ago, you know, this didn't exist. You would accumulate wealth throughout your life and then pass it on to your children, and then they would accumulate more and pass it on to their children. And everybody tried to spend as little as possible, and everybody tried to save as much as possible. I think the fact that this culture has shifted towards high consumption, where people, you know, spend somewhere between 95 and 105% of what they earn every month, and you can think of this as just being a normal way of existing, I don't think you can separate that from the fact that we have money that is losing its value. So, and the implications of this is that people move from being future-oriented towards being present-oriented. And it's not just something that is reflected economically. In my opinion, it's also reflected in art, it's reflected in culture, it's reflected in family structure, it's reflected in people's willingness to undertake long-term projects that pay off in the long run. And, you know, think about it. You know, artists 500 years ago used to spend months working on their masterpieces. Today, they spend hours, if you're lucky, drawing them. We don't have musicians who produce masterpieces like they did in the past. We have 3-minute songs, you know, with clicking a few buttons on a computer, and then the song comes out very quickly.
Buildings, like the pyramids.
Yes, buildings, architecture. This is something I didn't discuss in the book because I'm not really very expert on it. But, you know, travel anywhere in the world, compare 19th century buildings with 20th century buildings. It's really astonishing, particularly, you know, in places where government had a lot of control over architecture and building. And you see, you know, in the 19th century, they built things to last. Now they build things to get them done, to make them cheap, so that the government can say we have more houses for people. So I think the cultural and social implications of hard money are going to be tremendous. And I think as more and more people start using Bitcoin, we are witnessing this as a new economy emerging on the internet. It's almost like a new country was invented, and it has its own central bank. And it's the only central bank that's completely independent of US monetary policy and military policy. They can't change anything about Bitcoin's monetary policy. They can't close down the internet. They can't close down that country. And anybody in the world can just join that country. Anybody in the world can quit using their own central bank, whether it's the European or the Venezuelan or the American, and just join the internet central bank. And the internet central bank is automated. That's the most beautiful thing about it. It contains 0 economists, 0 PhDs. Nobody can affect it. Everybody's opinion is completely immaterial to it. And if you're sick of people's opinions, and if you're sick of people doing things that you don't agree with your money, Bitcoin is for you. This is the freedom that it gives us. It just allows you to store your value in something that does the job of a store of value by being scarce, without needing sophisticated central planning tools that really pretend to help, but they don't really help. And that brings me to the title of my book, The Bitcoin Standard. Effectively, what we're seeing is that this, those of you who remember the scaling debate around Bitcoin, people were talking about, Bitcoin is not going to scale, it's going to be a problem, and, Bitcoin is going to die. And instead, what do we see? Bitcoin continued to grow in terms of its price and in terms of the volume of transactions, but not in the number of transactions. So yes, there's a hard limit somewhere around maybe 500,000, maybe 1 million, maybe if there's a lot of optimization that developers will produce, maybe we'll get to be able to make 5 million transactions per day on Bitcoin. That would be optimistic, but still, 5 million transactions per day is not enough, not just for the world, it's not even enough for Munich, it's not even enough for a small city, 5 million transactions is nothing. So Bitcoin, obviously, if you think of it in terms of on-chain transactions, yes, it doesn't have the capacity to scale at a global level. However, what is happening now is you see that websites that use Bitcoin, they are using on-chain transactions less and less, and settling more and more of their transactions off-chain, transacting off-chain and then settling it finally on-chain. So now exchanges, for instance, instead of sending money to each other 500 times a day, they'll batch it all into one transaction at the end of the day that settles all of the Bitcoin balance, so they don't have to pay a transaction fee every time. So Bitcoin block space is becoming more and more expensive, and Bitcoin transactions are becoming more and more valuable, and they're rising in their value a lot more, to the point where you really, if you think about it, it's beginning to look like the gold standard. When the gold standard monetary system existed, you did not move physical gold for every transaction. So I would use a piece of paper backed by gold in the bank, and I would pay it to you, and the gold ounces stays where it is. And then at the end of the day, or the week, or the month, if there's a settlement between my bank and yours, or my central bank and yours, the gold bar would move to make that settlement. But for every actual movement of the gold bar, the physical gold, there were hundreds or thousands of movements and transactions taking place on the second layer. This is what is beginning to emerge with Bitcoin right now. This is how Bitcoin is going to scale. And according to this level, this scaling, with solutions like Lightning and other kinds of encryption solutions, we can get much safer second layer scaling with much less trust than the current banking system. And yet, it would be done on a base layer of hard money that can't be inflated. So the potential for this, I think, is enormous. And I think, people generally talk about the gold standard, and I discuss this in depth in my book, as La Belle Époque, the beautiful period. There were, that period between 1870 and 1914, the majority of the world was at peace. Nobody fought wars. Everybody was using gold to trade. Free trade reigned all over the world mostly. And yet, that all, I think, came crashing down with the move towards government money and the move towards inflation, and which allowed the financing of world wars and the endless financing of totalitarian government. And I think, that story, that 100-year story that we've had with government money is about to come to an end. Government money is a complete anomaly historically. The notion of government putting their stamp on money is not what makes money. Gold was money not because government put its stamp on it. Government put its stamp on money on gold because it was chosen as money in the market. And I think the 20th century saw the move away from gold and using paper money unbacked by gold. But I think potentially now we're seeing the 20th century online with a digital solution that is going to return us to a standard based on hard money that makes inflation possible and impossible, and makes stories like Venezuela hopefully never happen again. Okay? Thank you, everybody.
until I think the year 2130. After that, we will have the deflation probably because bitcoins are getting lost private keys or accidentally sent to Bitcoin cash addresses or something like that. So we will have a deflation. And how will this play out in 200, 300,000 years?
Yeah, I see no problem with it.
What are the implications of deflation, of continuous deflation?
Yeah, I mean, this is a very big debate in economics. It's one that I get to in depth in my book. So according to Keynesian economists, according to pretty much 99.9% of the economists that you would meet at your university, having a fixed money supply or a money supply that doesn't grow fast enough is going to cause deflation, which means that prices start dropping. And then if people think that prices of things are going to drop, they will start spending less. And then if people spend less, then the economy collapses and we get a recession. Cool story, but completely nonsensical. And it's just essentially government propaganda to justify inflationism, because we have endless examples to prove the opposite of this. The reality is you don't need more money for an economy to grow any more than you need the meter to get longer for you to get taller, right? The meter is just the unit of measurement, and you can grow tall even if we keep the meter fixed, right? In fact, that's how it happens. We keep the meter fixed and we measure as you grow taller. So money is the measure of the economic value that we create in a society. If the economic value created, you know, the apples and oranges and cars and buildings that we're making increase by, on average, let's say 5% per year, whereas the money supply stays constant, on average, the price of things is going to drop by 5%. But that's it. That's not a bad thing. The difference is, the Keynesians are correct in that it would lead to you spending less, but they are incorrect in assuming that it would lead to people not spending. And that's insane. You know, if I told you your money is going to double next year in value, not just 5%, assume doubling in value. How much money are you going to spend on food this year? Zero? You still need to eat, right? And if you don't eat, you're not going to be around to have your money double in value. You still need a roof over your head. You still need the essentials and the important things that you want. You will need them. But what about the stupid nonsense that you don't need?
Will not buy it.
Exactly. Now you're going to start thinking about it. So what we call this is time preference, how much you value the present versus the future. Bitcoin, or hard money, or the gold standard, lowers time preference. It doesn't eliminate it. Lowering time preference means people spend less on stupid nonsense that they don't need, like all the plastic crap that you see in supermarkets and everywhere, both edible and inedible, and start focusing on spending their money on things that they actually need, that are beneficial to them. And then they save their money, and it gains value. So if you live in a society that had, a money gaining value 5% per year, in about 16, 17 years, your money doubles in value. On the other hand, if it's losing 5% per year, in 16, 17 years, it loses half its value. So imagine which one is more likely to see you save 10 or 20 or 30% of your income. Obviously, the one where it is appreciating. So another story aspect of it, we're not going to get into it in detail, but is the interest rate. When easy money means more money supply, lower interest rates. Lower interest rates do not incentivize people to save. This is why nobody puts savings in the banks, because you get 0 or 1%. But this is why everybody borrows, because you can borrow at 0 or 1 or 2%, right? So you move away from a society based on debt and high consumption to a society based on saving, capital accumulation, and investment. Now, which one is better? According to the Keynesian story, if we start just investing and accumulating capital, then we all die because we're not spending. But this is really, I mean, beneath idiotic. I mean, really, because the only way that we build civilization as human beings, the only way that we change from being, you know, monkeys slinging our dirt at each other in the jungle, is through delayed gratification, is through lowering our time preference, is through being able to think of the future. It's through delaying immediate consumption right now. You know, instead of just going and catching fish with my hands, the first humans started thinking, instead of catching them with my hand, I'm going to spend time not on producing consumer goods. I'm not going to consume. I'm going to have a low time preference. I'm going to commit the Keynesian crime of thinking of the future, and I'm going to build a fishing rod instead. So why do people build fishing rods? because once you have it, you can increase your productivity. And so then when you start producing and catching fish later, you're catching at a higher productivity. So this is the process of capital accumulation, and it has to come from delayed gratification and from reduced consumption. And this is how civilization happens. People reduce their consumption, and of course, it's not going to cause unemployment if you're not reducing your consumption, because the people who want to work, instead of working in the consumer goods, instead of working on, selling you beer for parties, because everybody's always spending all their money on partying, they would be working in the capital goods sector, in the production of goods early on in the sector. And so the capital accumulation at once frees up resources from consumption goods towards capital goods, and also puts the money aside for consumption in the future. You're not saving, you're not spending the money now, but where is that money going to go? Eventually the future is going to come, and eventually you're going to spend it. So this notion, it's just typical Keynesian short-termism, the idea that if people don't spend now, the economy just stops. It doesn't work that way. It's a dynamic process. People spending now are spending the savings of last year and 10 years ago, and people saving today will be spending 1 or 10 years ago. And the more that we save, the more capital we accumulate, and the more wealth we grow. And okay, yes, it's enough.
You assume that people use fiat money as store of value and medium of exchange, which in my experience is an assumption which is true in some cases, but in many cases it's not true, because we use property as a store of value. We use art, Picassos, old timers, stocks, shares, whatever as a store of value, and that works fine for me. Fiat works fine for me because I use it as a medium of exchange, because I buy a loaf of bread tomorrow, and since I'm not in Venezuela, it's pretty stable. But then every time I have like 500 euro left on my bank account, I buy stores or buy property or buy old cars or whatever comes into mind that serves as a store of value. And this is why the prices of these goods have been continually rising. So fiat is no store of value, it's only medium of exchange, and it works as a medium of exchange.
Well, fiat is still a store of value, because it wouldn't be a medium of exchange if it weren't. The fact is that the guy who accepts it, the baker who accepts it, he's storing value in it, even if it's just for a day or a week or so. But you're right in that it's a lousy store of value. And as a result of that, because of the fiat inflation over the last 20, 30, 40, 50 years, people have lost the ability to store their value in something reliable. And instead, everybody in the world today is just continuously trying to speculate on which is going to be the best store of value over the next week or month or year. And buy this stock or sell that stock, or buy this house or sell that old car, and all of these things. I think this is, it's a sign of the failure of money to serve its function as a store of value, that people, for instance, who don't want an extra house, are buying an extra house because it's better than keeping the money in the bank. That people keep investing their money into stock markets, which leads to all these bubbles. And the key thing about all of these things is, housing and all, okay, they may sound like good stores of value, but in the long run, they're not. Why? Because they're not hard. Well, art is hard. Rare art is hard, so it could serve as a good store of value. If you buy a Leonardo da Vinci painting, it'll likely hold its value. But houses are not good stores of value, because people can always build more and more and more houses. And so if you think about all the bubbles that we see under fiat money, you have to understand them as part of this dynamic. In the 2000s, everybody in the US, there was nobody who had any money in their bank. Everybody put all their money in houses. As a result, there were something like 20 million extra houses being made. Why? It's easy to make more houses until the supply increases, just like the story with copper. So this trap catches everything. And people are always trying to escape fiat as a store of value. But the only thing that I think will beat this trap, and we're going to have a lot of bubbles, but in the long run, I think Bitcoin will continue to win out from those bubbles. When the bubble bursts, like this bubble, we went from what, 200 to 20,000. Okay, well, it's gone down, but still 7,000, still a much larger number. The reason is nobody can make Bitcoin. That's why I think it's going to naturally just win the store of value race, because people who put money in it are just going to end up doing much better than others.
So would you agree that the price, or currently the price does not show the real value of Bitcoin, because maybe most of the people investing in Bitcoin are
I mean, I think, you know, there's no such a thing as the intrinsic value in economics, as I like to understand it. Like from the Austrian school's perspective on economics, all value is subjective. It just depends on what people value it with. So for instance, think about oil. 200 years ago, you had to pay people to come take oil from your land if your land had oil because you couldn't grow anything or build anything on it. Oil had a negative value. Today, it's extremely valuable. The same oil, it hasn't changed. But what has changed is people's perceptions of it. So for me right now, you know, the Bitcoin price reflects people's valuation right now. Enough people how many people want to hold Bitcoin and keep its value at this price, and who don't want to sell at this price is what gives it that price. So it's accurate in that it is a reflection of what is going on right now. But, you know, as a prediction of what's going to happen later, you know, I can't make any predictions about it because, you know, tomorrow something happens and people change their mind and they drum. So we're still at a very early stage, and we could get a lot of big variations in the price, both up and down. Yes?
Well, I have a question. When you listen to Trace Mayer, or also you mentioned in your book another book from Davidson and Rees-Mogg, Sovereign Individual, they talk about how Bitcoin or cybercash in the case of Davidson, how they change the power structure, and the balance of violence, or the power of violence, and how it changes the relation between the individual and society, and the individual and the government. How do you see the nation state develop in the next 10, 20 years? How do you see the development of, how do you see this impacting government's capacity to tax and to control society in the way that we experience it today?
I think if I were to summarize it, I would say the whole world is going to start looking more and more like Switzerland. So who knows who's the president of Switzerland here? Anybody knows? Nobody, right? Don't feel like you're ignorant or anything. Yeah, but in Switzerland, nobody knows. Even the Swiss people don't know or care. Why? Because he doesn't matter. They don't have a strong leader and a strong president and a strong government. And as you, I'm sure, know, you know, they're struggling in famine and civil war because of the absence of government, right? No, it's not the case. Switzerland seems to be doing far better than everybody else who seems to have a government. In fact, the more you hear, the more people know about the president of a country, the worse life is. Everybody here knows the president of Venezuela, right? How's that working out for the Venezuelans? How's you know, Kim Jong-il is very popular, very well known around the world. Yeah, so I think, I mean, the lesson here is this. Switzerland, the reason Switzerland is like that is that Switzerland was the last country to remain on the gold standard. And I talk a lot about it. I talk about how they never had recessions in Switzerland until they went off the gold standard. And, you know, politically, Switzerland is built on essentially mostly municipal local taxation, which is, you know, okay, taxation, but, you know, it's relatively very easy for you to move from one municipality to the other in case things go badly. In other words, it's almost as if taxation there is optional. It's not even coercive. You know, it's not that big of a deal. Nobody puts a gun to your head that you have to spend weeks filling out forms to then pay 30% of your income, and then if you make a small mistake, you go to jail. And I think the reason for, you know, in general, the way to understand this is, again, from that excellent book by called The Sovereign Individual, which was written about 20 years ago, and it provides an excellent explanation of Bitcoin and the effect of it, even though it was written before Bitcoin was invented, because they could foresee that something like this would be invented. And the key thing for them is that the industrialization is what gave us the modern nation state, because industrialization put economic value concentrated into small areas. So for instance, in a city like Munich, you know, all of the major factories of the region would come into major cities. And then if you just had a few soldiers come and take over Munich, you took over all the economy of the region. It was all, or not even take over Munich, take over a few important factories and locations in Munich. That's it. You know, you could take over and you could threaten the owners. And so therefore governments were very strong because they could easily control physical resources. Now, the majority of our work, the majority of people don't produce physical things. The majority of people produce immaterial goods. They produce services that can be produced on a laptop from anywhere in the world. And the final jigsaw in the puzzle of the move towards the digital world is when the money with which we transact the value of those things itself also becomes digital. So now we're selling digital goods for digital magic internet money, and governments, they are going to find it very, very hard to butt in between those transactions between people. And instead of having the ability to just surround your factory and put a gun to your head and say you have to give us 40% of taxes or we burn the factory down, now their factories are just individuals walking around in the street producing, writing, making software or so on. This is the value, and the price of it is being paid digitally. So they can't put a gun to people's head. And also, the other thing is, if you built a factory, I can put a gun to your head, and if you refuse, I shoot you, I get another people, the factory still runs. But if you're, say, a programmer, and I put a gun to your head, your productivity is going to decline. Violence and threat is not very effective against human beings when the human being themselves embody the capital that is productive. So I think their ability to control economic activity is going to decline in the digital age. And that's why the title of that book is The Sovereign Individual. That as individuals now, you have your own money, the government can't control it, you can travel with it, you can move it around, you can remember the PIN code, the private key, and just carry the money around. And I think the end result is that governments, instead of forcing people, are going to have to try to compete for the productive people. So the governments that are going to try and fight Bitcoin and try and fight digitization are just going to shoot themselves in the foot and make themselves into the North Koreas of the 21st century. Whereas the places that embrace it, the places that will allow people to come in, the places that will tell you, okay, we're going to give you low taxes, we just want you to come, these places will prosper because all the creative people will go there and all the other people will want to live there. And eventually, the contrast is going to, I think, become so strong that it's going to lead to more and more countries becoming more like Switzerland, in my opinion, yeah.
Do you see any countries that already start down that path or send first signals out?
Okay, Venezuela passport.
Yeah. I don't know.
Malta is a good example.
Malta, Liechtenstein a little bit as well. Slovenia, Austria, Switzerland. I mean, there are places where the Bitcoin sort of economy is growing more, but in terms of governments, the only governments that have started talking about Bitcoin or digital currencies right now are still in the let's make our own shitcoin phase. And, everybody goes through that phase for a couple of years. They'll learn the hard way eventually. But, it's obviously if there's no difference between a government-issued cryptocurrency and the national currency. This is what, the majority of euros and dollars and francs are all digital anyway. So, the papers is just 10 or 20% or something of the value of the total money. So it's already digital money. There's no value of it from that. But I think the real value is when one country thinks about adopting it as a central bank reserve. I don't know if anybody's doing it, but I would imagine if somebody was doing it, if I were them, I'd keep it quiet. I would not be the one to be the first one to announce it, because as long as you don't announce it, you can keep buying up more and more and more. Italy? You think? Well, I hope so. We'll see. Yes, you had a question?
You both were mentioning that our normal money is manipulated by governments, they are the robbers. And in the Bitcoin ecosystem, we see whales. People, accounts who hold big amounts of Bitcoins and who are able to manipulate the market in the same way. What's your opinion on that?
I don't think they can manipulate it in the same way. As a whale, it doesn't matter how big you are, because the only thing that you can do is buy or sell. If you buy, you raise the price. If you sell, you drop the price. And you can only keep buying so much before you run out of other money, and you can only keep selling so much before you run out of your own Bitcoin. So it's not really easy.
Let me add to that. You can also make news to manipulate the market.
Yeah, that definitely happens. But, that's the fault of the people who believe the news, not the people who spread it. So, no news has ever caused me to ever consider selling any of my Bitcoin, and that's worked out very well for me so far. I think the fundamental difference is that it's possible to manipulate any market if you are able to print the money. And this is why I think, manipulation is definitely there in the world of shitcoins, because the people behind those coins are very capable of creating an extra supply, or having, they have the pre-mine and they have the hidden supply and they have all this. Ripple has something like, what, 60 billion ripples sitting on the side. You know, with that sort of thing, you can always manipulate the supply in any way you want. Ethereum, they have a similar large pre-mine. So with these sort of things, yes, but I think, and of course, the whales will have a significant effect on the market, but as Bitcoin continues to grow, you know, the advantage, yeah, it'll become harder for them, and also the advantage of the early mover is going to be removed. You know, the notion that, you know, sorry to break it to all of the hodlers here, you know, if you bought your Bitcoin at $1, you think you're going to remain, you know, you're going to become the new Rothschilds for the rest of the world, your life, because you got it. It's not going to work. Eventually, you're going to run out of it, and then the only way to get more of it is to be productive. So, you know, maybe for the next 20, 50, 100 years or so, you and your grandkids can enjoy being the Rothschilds, but eventually, if you want to be very, very rich in a world in which money is hard, you can't just rely on luck. You have to just find something, produce something valuable that people will pay you hard money for. And so eventually, you know, you have to choose. I mean, either you're going to have to live like a king and spend the coins in which you're going to run out, or you keep them in which you don't get to live like a king. So eventually, you know, you're going to have to get back to work. And I think Wales is just, you know, a transition period. Yeah.
How did silver lose its monetary status? Because it was the people's money.
Uh-huh.
It has been used for centuries, and all of a sudden it went away.
Well, blame Germany with everything. No, I'm joking. But actually, it is the fault. It was Germany that really killed silver as gold, and specifically in 1871. I discussed this in my book, because when the Germans won the Franco-Prussian War, they forced the French to pay them the what was it called, the indemnity, or what was it called when you beat somebody? Yeah, the reparations. Germany was on the silver standard. France, Britain, Switzerland, Holland, and a bunch of other countries were on the gold standard. But Germany and a few others, and China and India were on silver. But Germany was the biggest economy on silver at that time. So when they took the money from France in the form of gold, they shifted to the gold standard. At that point, you had France, Germany, Britain, Switzerland. Essentially, all of the main economies were on gold. And so everybody now had the choice of shifting towards gold or staying with silver. And you can see it. There's a chart in my book that shows us the price of silver historically had always been between 12 to 4 ounces of silver per ounce of gold until that date, until 1871. And then it just, you know, it's a flat line between 12 and 14. You know, we have stories from hundreds and thousands of years of people describing this price ratio. And then 1871, the price ratio is just completely gone. So then it goes up to 20, 30, and now it's at around 70 or so. And since 1870, silver is practically, okay, up and down, but the trend is for it to just lose more and more and more of its value. And the reason is that, you know, once, there's no point of having two monies. There is never a point for having two money. The only reason there was a point for having silver as money was when gold was used physically and silver were used physically. At that point, you couldn't make gold coins small enough to be useful for small transactions, so people would use silver. But then once transactions started being with paper backed by gold, then it didn't matter what size the gold was, because you could make papers that were tiny or large or any size you wanted. So there was no longer any purpose for having silver as money, and that destroyed its monetary role.
This brings me to an interesting part, because Gabriel said that he loves all kind of crypto coins or blockchain coins. Like
Except the scams, so we agree.
Except the scams, yeah. So, but doesn't this situation...
Okay. Sorry. Yeah.
But doesn't this situation inflate the whole idea of having a standard cryptocurrency? Because there are a lot of people out there, especially promoting the old form of money, saying, hey, I mean, theoretically you have
21 million Bitcoin, but you can have 21 million different kinds of currencies.
You just need to make sure that enough people
Yeah.
are there out there trusting in this new type of coin or whatever, and then you can inflate the whole market there.
Yeah, no, I don't agree with that for the simple reason that Bitcoin is the only digital currency that is hard to make. Okay, if you want to make a Bitcoin right now, you need to spend about $7,000 on mining, roughly, in order to make one Bitcoin. That's it. If you want to make any other coin, sure, they do have proof of work or so on, But really, it's absolutely trivial for any other coin to hard fork its code and change its money supply. Let's face it. I mean, we've seen with the second biggest coin after Bitcoin, Ethereum, when the owners and the managers and the people who were behind the foundation behind it, they had their money lost. They had no problem hard forking, and they hard fork all the time. And we see with all the other coins, it's very trivial to hard fork them. So if one of these coins becomes used as a regular store of value, it would be largely trivial for, say, any government to go and infiltrate the coders and change the supply for it. And you know, the reason is that once, you know, it's the way that I like to describe it is all of these coins, it's like they just get a red tablecloth, they put it on their back, and they jump from the 10th story of the building and think, Superman does it and he can fly. We have a red thing, I can fly. You know, if you just copy the design of Bitcoin, you're not going to just become decentralized and immutable, as we're finding out now with the 51% attacks that are killing all these trash coins. And hopefully, long may they continue. But yeah, exactly. And so, you know, the reason that Bitcoin works, the reason that Bitcoin can be said to be immutable, that it is decentralized, that nobody can change the money supply, is not because, you know, it's the design. It's because of the economic system and how it has evolved. It's because, and most importantly, because the creator created it and left. It did not grow because there was a marketing team behind it. There was no foundation talking about it. There were no press articles published in Forbes magazine that are just essentially glowing PR nonsense about stupid buzzwords that make no sense. The guy disappeared. The marketing budget for Bitcoin has always been zero. He disappeared, and it grew on its own because it provided good economic incentives for people to use it. So people have been using it, but nobody has been able to control it. And you know, this got really confirmed last year when we had 90% of the miners, 90% of the owners of the hashing power, maybe 90% of all the most influential and well-known startups in the Bitcoin ecosystem, all of the well-known Bitcoiners and the early Bitcoiners, they all agreed that they wanted to just increase the block size, you know, and it's almost a trivial engineering design, but they wanted to set the precedent of making a hard fork. And what happened? They ended up with yet another shitcoin. That's it, and Bitcoin continues as it is. So this, you know, until any other, this is why Bitcoin can claim to be immutable monetary policy. You don't just code it and say, well, I coded it to be 21 million and now it's 21 million. No. So at what cost would it take to change it? In the case of Bitcoin, we've seen right now it's very, very, very difficult to change it, to the point where, you know, people like me, after a long time of being skeptical, now I'm beginning to accept that, yeah, it might actually work and it might actually not be changed. But no other coin comes anywhere near replicating this. No other coin can claim that. It's absolutely trivial for anyone, Ripple or Litecoin or any of those people, the people behind them, it's such a small group, and it's a group of people who have, you know, actively promoted it and coded it and owned the hash power for it, and so they have all of the power that is needed in order to affect any particular change. So to go back to your question, I don't see them as competing with Bitcoin as hard money in the first place, and so you know, they are going to suffer from this hyperinflation, which is that, yeah, you can't just always keep your currency as the next flashy new thing, because, you know, you're just one group of people launching your own currency, but there's a world that's big, and, you know, just like we saw, Ethereum was the leader of all of the massive buzzwords about that. And now we're seeing EOS coming and, you know, out Ethereuming Ethereum by doing even more fancy buzzwords. And so on. But, you know, you can keep adding these on, and I think eventually all of these, the altcoins are easy money. Even if, because, number one, because their own supply can be edited, and secondly, because there's nothing to differentiate them from one another. You know, regardless of all of the stuff that you hear about, essentially all digital currencies are just the same thing that Satoshi had, which is cryptographically, private key, public key, send, receive, blockchain, common record. That's all that they do. You know, for all the talk about innovation and stuff, it's all vaporware at this point. Beyond that, yeah.
Are there any downsides for Bitcoin standard? Probably there's a difference in the transparency of the whole ledger compared to transactions in gold or fiat money, which are
yeah. People think that the one problem with Bitcoin is anonymity and fungibility. However, I actually think it might not be. It might not really be a problem. In fact, it might actually be an advantage for it to be used in this system. Because the way that I think about it is that we'd end up with something like somewhere between, let's say, 1,000 to 100,000 node operators acting as central banks, depending on how many transactions we can do per day. And those are the only people who get to make on-chain transactions, whereas everybody else does second layer transactions. So in that case, you know, it's actually very good that all those banks have all of their balance sheets effectively on the blockchain available for everybody to monitor. But then anonymity will be trivial to enforce on a second layer. Just go to a bank that doesn't tell anybody what you do. And go to a bank that doesn't collect your information. Go to a bank that just uses a throwaway email address to contact you that has no link with your information. And you know, in a free market where banking is a free market as opposed to what it is right now, I think there'd be no problem with these banks emerging. I think that we're going to see more and more of this happening on Bitcoin. So I think anonymity will not be a problem on the second layer. I don't know. You ask me for drawbacks, but you know, generally I'm always extra bullish, and I'm not. You know, find somebody else to talk bad about Bitcoin.
it'll be weird if you have a job in a hyper-Bitcoinized world and you have to accept that you make 5% less nominally every year because that's the rate at which.
Well, most likely you won't be making less nominally. You'll be making the same amount, but
purchasing power, but
the purchasing.
Gets smaller, right?
I think it's more likely that the purchasing power would the amount of.
You for 1 Bitcoin a year, but over 30 years of deflation or appreciation of the purchasing.
Yeah, what usually happens is that you know you don't give me a pay cut, but the one you know the pay rise is just the rise in the value of the Bitcoin.
Perspective would have to change.
I mean, you know, under the gold standard, people spent say 30 years earning the same amount of income. You know, you would be earning 1 ounce of gold, say a month, and that would be it. You know, and 30 years of earning the same amount of money, but it appreciates a little bit.
That's a difference. That's something
Yeah.
you might perceive as a negative.
Yeah, I mean, the Keynesian idea, Keynesian economics is motivated by Keynes saying that, you know, workers prefer big numbers. And that's it. You know, you would rather, yeah. Obviously, you know, what do you prefer, having 1 Bitcoin or 10 billion bolivars? Obviously 10 billion bolivars, right? Because it makes you a multi-billionaire. Yeah, that was the sort of Keynesian idea. All of Keynes's economics was accepted that, you know, if you just let the economy sort itself out, prices would drop and wages would drop and the economy would adjust. But he thought workers would not accept wage drops. So let's keep their wages constant and then we print money and then prices rise. Same thing happens, but the workers remain happy. That's the supposed idea because now they have bigger numbers. But, you know, if you think that's, yeah, if you think like that, it's going to be a problem for you to be in a Bitcoin world, yeah.
Do you see the possibility that the resource consumption resulting from more mining might, in the end, turn into a real ecological problem, or at least a problem in terms of how Bitcoin is perceived in public?
Yeah, it's definitely a problem in how Bitcoin is perceived, but that's not Bitcoin's problem. That's the perceiver's problem. And eventually, you know, that's only going to change when people learn economics and when they learn that, you know, we are not wasting resources when we use them for proof of work or when you use them to fly an airplane to go visit your mom or to go on vacation. You decided, you worked, you earned the money, and you decided you wanted to burn it on this. You know, you wanted to go on an airplane that will fly you to Bali so that you go party in Bali. Is that a waste? Should you be allowed to do it? Should you not be allowed to do it? Who gets to decide? Well, the reality is in economics, you decide for yourself and everybody decides for themselves. And then the emergent output is the best output possible because it comes out of people's own decisions. Now, I don't think it's a problem that we consume energy. And in fact, you know, we may end up, and I think this might be the case, that we might end up in a world in which Bitcoin mining consumes exactly half the energy that is produced on the planet Earth. And frankly, I think that there's nothing else better. I can't think of a better thing to do than to use the technology of electricity to automate the financial and monetary system of the world and get it out of the hands of government. We're not replacing banking. We're not replacing credit cards. So, you know, people who tell you, well, one credit card transaction costs this much energy, whereas your Bitcoin transaction costs that much, it doesn't matter. What we're replacing with Bitcoin is US foreign policy, is the ability of the US to go and invade countries all day. What we're replacing with Bitcoin is the possibility of another Venezuela ever emerging. and of another Zimbabwe ever happening. If you don't think that's worth half of your electricity consumption, then really look at what you do with your electricity and tell me what's more worthwhile. And, you know, it's in the long run, electricity production for Bitcoin will move towards areas where it doesn't compete with civilian infrastructure. So hydroelectric energy is very cheap at source, but very expensive to transport. So if you put the miners there, they would consume that energy, and instead of sending energy through cables, which is very expensive and loses efficiency, they'll just send proof of work and hashes and so on, which are very cheap and easy to send. So in the long run, I think, you know, we're going to end up with a massive infrastructure of power generation that is just there to secure this network and ensure that we never end up with government money again. Yeah.
Just a very short remark. Halving the price of the energy in production doesn't change anything. You would just use twice as much. So let's see the dynamics you explained minutes ago, that the supply is independent of the demand.
I didn't say we're going to, I said eventually we'll reach a point where half the electricity is spent on Bitcoin and the other half is spent on everything else. On all economic value, so half of all, and right now, you know, people talk about, yeah, then people talk about, well, Bitcoin is spending as much electricity as what, which country are we now? Uruguay or Poland or whatever? Denmark. Exactly, so should we ban Bitcoin or Denmark? What do you guys think? I mean, who gets to decide? You know, once it spends as much electricity as the rest of the world, then Bitcoin will have arrived, I think.
Yeah,
yes?
What people always forget here is that Bitcoin gives the incentive to improve energy production, right? So,
yeah, that's another fact.
More innovation in terms of how to harness energy from
in a cheaper way.
In a cheaper way from
yep.
and renewing resources.
Like saying burning oil fields is increasing the like making an incentive for making more efficient parks. So you can burn all the oil fields and we will have more efficient parks because we make oil a scarce resource and burning the field. So it's
no.
But basically, this is happening. I mean, the oil supply is reducing over time because more and more people want to have oil, so there's less oil for you.
Person on the street that they appreciate burning oil fields because they are now already complaining because of their gas prices.
Okay, maybe we can talk about
that.
Okay. Okay, one more question?
Yeah.
Okay, one last question, yeah.
Question on this point. You mentioned the adjusted hash rate and the increase of the mining cost. And so there's usually the treatise that with precious metal, the mining cost, the price cannot be far too below the mining cost. But isn't it a danger for Bitcoin if the mining costs are lower or the price is lower than the mining cost, that the people won't mine again and then the network is not secure?
Yes, but if I mean, if demand for Bitcoin drops, demand for using it drops. So you're going to need, you'll have fewer transactions, you'll have the value drop, and then the hash rate will drop. It readjusts so that it's always, so that it's always economical. So you know, to the point that even if Bitcoin were to collapse to that only 10 people are using it next year, the difficulty would just continue to adjust downwards, and then the whole thing would work. Exactly, but it doesn't need to be secure if it's only 10 people using it. You see what I mean? Yeah. Yeah. Oh, I think we have to head to that, but we could talk in person.
Sorry, we've got prepared some great food for you, and I think you're still
Yes,
around. So
I'll be here.
we've
I'll
got
be here
time
to talk.
discuss. 2 more remarks. Thank you very much.
Thank you.
Great
Cheers.
talk.
Thank you.
Please finish the food we've prepared tonight. Otherwise, it's going to rain tomorrow, and the Bitcoin price is going to drop. So finish everything, please. You're welcome to use the roof terrace on your own risk. Please be careful. We're 80 meters above ground, so if you don't want to drop, be careful up there. And please don't step on the glass hubs. We have like 3 or 4, because then you're going to fall into the 10th floor, which is also not good if you don't move terrace. So please be careful.
Okay.
Thank you, and Great to have you all here.
Thank you. Thank you so much. Thanks a lot, really.
Thanks.
Really appreciate it.
Great talk.
Thank you very much.
I read the book, but I still don't read it.
Oh, really?